Alright, so, I was trawling around the internet a while ago and I found this. This is a manga about the Second Punic War. Japan's fucking crazy. I need a beer. Hello everybody and welcome back to another episode of Drunk History with Graf. This is a series in which I drink some alcohol and talk about history, starting from the Bronze Age going all the way up to present day. Last episode we talked about the conquest of most of the Seleucid Empire by the Parthians and the War of the Heavenly Horses, as well as the Han-Zhongnu War. In this episode we're going to be going back to Rome and we're going to look at how some of those cracks in Roman society split right open. So, last we left off, the Mediterranean Sea looked like this. Rome's taken up most of it, but not quite all of it. There is still Egypt that is free, most of neighbouring Libya, which is mostly unoccupied, the Levantine shore, which is still occupied by the Seleucid rump state, and the Numidian kingdom. Now, the Numidian kingdom had been Rome's ally for the past 100 years, as it had helped them to defeat Carthage under the Prince Massinissa. However, Massinissa, although he was very young when he did what he did, eventually grew old and died. The first generation of Numidian kings after him went fairly uneventfully. However, the second generation after him is where things got ugly. You see, the second Numidian king had two legitimate sons and one illegitimate son called Jugurtha. And given the fact that I have not given the other two's name, and I have given his name, you can probably assume what happens. Jugurtha usurps the throne, kills his two brothers. And so, in 111, war were declared by Rome on Numidia. Initially, this went particularly badly for Rome. The first two consular armies sent into Numidia to defeat Jugurtha were themselves defeated. However, after them came two men who would define the next era. Previously, I talked about the macroeconomic things that were leading Rome to its own destruction. But now, this is where we come to the personal side. Historians have a couple of different models for how to measure history. One of these is the Marxist view of history, which views pretty much everything as being economic. The Marxist theory of history looks at what is called the dialectic of history, in other words, history progressing through a series of economic states, which according to the Marxists would inevitably end in communism. Now that's bullshit, but looking at the economic state of things does give us a pretty good insight into how the world is working, and that is what I have been using up until this point to look at Rome. Another of these is called the Great Person theory, which suggests that history is moved forward by the actions of important or influential people. The way that I've explained Rome so far has mostly been looking at it from a sort of a semi-Marxist perspective, but now I'm going to shift into looking at it in a great person perspective, because this is where the big personalities start to come in. Rome sends in two extremely important people, the consul Gaius Marius and his quaestor Lucius Cornelius Sulla. And what happens is Sulla goes down to Mauritania, which is down here, and bribes the king there to betray Jugurtha. The Mauritanian king offers Jugurtha a meeting in which they could consider joining the war on Jugurtha's side. But instead, when Jugurtha arrives, he is promptly executed by the Mauritanians, putting an end to the Jugurthine War. However, although the Jugurthine War was just about ending, there was a new problem that Rome was having to contend with. So now we're going to have to look far to the north, somewhere we haven't looked yet, into Germania, because it was at about this time that the Cimbrian tribe, a Germanic tribe located in Jutland, decided that it was time to do a migration, and they marched south. Now it has to be noted that the Germans, and by extension the Cimbrians, were not a nomadic group. However, this is back in a time when entire tribes, in times of hardship, can just pack up and leave and migrate to new areas. And when tribes go and migrate, usually they bulldoze just about everything in their path. with a migrating tribe, there is no retreat. They go where they go. There's nowhere for them to return to. And what ended up happening was the Cimbrians ended up sweeping with them a number of tribes and heading into Noricum and displacing many of the Tauriski. And the Tauriski were a Celtic tribe. Now, something that really should be clarified about the whole Celtic Germanic thing, we can tell nowadays when we look at these peoples who are German and who are Celtic because they have very different languages. However, the Romans generally didn't because they were a profoundly arrogant people and usually would just sort of look at it and say anybody on the south or west side of the Rhine was a Gaul and anyone who's on the other side is a German. So just keep that in mind. Anyway, the Tauruski went and asked the Romans for help. They did not need to ask twice because the Cimbrians were barreling south and were about to enter Italy, which meant that the Romans had no choice but to respond. So the Romans sent an army under consul Gnaeus Papirius Carbo, who went and made a demand to the Cimbrii and their allies that they are to turn around and go the other way. The Cimbrii were initially willing to comply with this. However, they found out that Carbo actually intended to ambush them as they turned around, and so attacked. It was not a difficult battle, given that the Cimbrii numbered most likely in excess of 100,000 warriors, and the Romans had only 30,000. The Romans ended up being crushed. The Cimbrii then moved west over the Alps and into Gaul, so the Romans decided that they had to go and raise a new legion. However, they ran into a problem. You see, the way that the Roman army worked was it was made up of a corps of heavy infantry, heavily armoured and heavily armed. And the way that this worked was that these would be from the middle class, who would have enough money to buy their equipment to join the army. And that's how it was. You bought your own equipment when you went to the army. You were not provided by the state. And this was a massive mark of pride among Romans. One of the reasons that Rome became such a militaristic society was because to join the military was seen as a mark of pride, to be wealthy enough to afford to do so. However, you might recall that in the last couple of episodes, the economic situation in Rome has been deteriorating really badly. And this class, which normally would make up the majority of the Roman army, was disappearing at a rapid rate. So the Romans did not have enough men who were capable of taking up arms. So, in steps Gaius Marius, or Marius, I'm just going to call him Marius. Just bear in mind that usually I use reconstructed classical Latin pronunciation rather than modern. Marius went in and changed this. He made a number of significant reforms called the Marian reforms, the most significant of these being that those who had no property of their own, those who were not wealthy enough to buy their own arms and armor, would now be provided by the state. Rather than having what's essentially a citizen levy whenever there's a crisis, the Roman state would now have a standing, professional army. Roman citizens would now be enlisted for a term of 16 years. He also made other reforms, such as Rome's Italian allies were now allowed to send their own soldiers into the Roman army, and if they did so, those soldiers that fought would be granted Roman citizenship. And that was a great incentive to get more people willing to join up, because Roman citizenship meant a lot of privileges. Examples include that in a trial, a Roman citizen's testimony would always be seen as more reliable than a non-Roman citizen, even a citizen of Rome's Italian allies. But while this all looks like a great thing on paper, it is not so black and white. This causes some pretty serious problems down the line. Most importantly, it put the onus for providing the material, the pay, and the equipment onto the general. The citizen levies that had previously made up Rome's armies had been loyal to the state of Rome, because they had a place within it, and they had a stake in it being stable. However, because this was no longer the case, and the Roman armies were now made up of the landless poor, they were there under the state which had watched them become destitute, and so they were no longer as loyal to the idea of Rome as they were to the general who was paying them and who was giving them their arms and armour. This will become very important later. The Marian reforms also removed the old system of the consular armies and replaced them with the system more familiar to us now of the legions. Initially, these would still function in the same way under the consular armies, in that the consuls would be the two generals and they would have a number of legions underneath them. But later, this would grow and escalate into each legion being its own army with its own general, which would do its own thing. In 102 BC, Marius led his newly reformed legions north to face the Cimbrii once again, and this time he was much more successful. In 101 BC, the Cimbrii moved south over the Alps once again and headed into Italy, where Marius faced them at the Battle of Vercellae. This time, the Cimbrii numbered 100,000 still, and the Romans 54,000. This is still pretty bad odds, but not insurmountable. Given that the Cimbrii came from modern-day Denmark, and the Romans from Italy, the climate was a huge advantage, as the Cimbrii were quickly exhausted by the heat, and the Romans continued fighting even though their enemy were fatigued. Unlike previous engagements in the Alps, the Cimbrii were not able to defeat the Romans. The Cimbrii, with nothing left, ended up turning to mass suicide, with women killing both themselves and their children to avoid slavery. With the end of the Cimbrian War, we're going to now look east, back to Anatolia. With the Seleucids so diminished by the Parthian invasion, there now remains only 3 main real kingdoms left in Anatolia, these being Bithynia, Pontus, and Cappadocia. There's also Armenia off further to the east, but they don't really do anything, so they don't count. By far and away the most powerful of these was the Kingdom of Pontus, led by King Mythridates VI. And this guy is absolutely fantastic. I'm probably going to do a Side of Stories episode on him. He gained the nickname the Poison King from ingesting a shit ton of different poisons in an early attempt to immunization, which actually worked, which meant that he was essentially immune to assassination by poison, which was the most common method at the time. Another thing that made Mithridates so special was that he actually marched north around the Black Sea and engaged the Scythians in battle and defeated them, which is an extremely rare thing for a settled civilization to defeat a nomadic one. Mithridates was a firm enemy of Rome and was attempting to gain power in the area in order to potentially resist Rome. And so, he assassinated the king of Cappadocia and placed a puppet on his throne. Repeatedly, Cappadocia would rebel against the puppet ruler, forcing Mithridates to invade over and over again to try and ensure his legitimacy. Eventually, Rome sent a message through the Pontic ambassador that Mithridates had to withdraw from Cappadocia, which he acquiesced to. Later, when Bithynia was having a succession crisis, Pontus decided to invade and take the kingdom for himself. Then, Mithridates did something very strange. On the advice of a philosopher who was his advisor, he went and carried out something that's been called the Asiatic Vespers, which is essentially a genocide of all Romans living in Pontus and Bithynia. It is estimated that 80,000 Romans and other Italians were killed in these Asiatic Vespers. As you can imagine, Rome was pretty pissed at this, and so Rome sent an army under the now consul Lucius Cornelius Sulla, or I'm just going to call him Sulla. Now, Sulla had been in Cilicia dealing with pirates. Cilicia is here, by the way. So Sulla marched north to go and take care of Mithridates, which he should have been able to do fairly easily. However, he had a problem, and that was that he had just been relieved of his post for basically no reason due to bribery from none other than Gaius Marius, who had bribed the Senate to remove him from his position and replace him with Marius, which, by the way, would have been his 6th term as consul, which is very illegal. At this point, Sulla got so annoyed that instead of taking it out on Pontus, he marshaled his army and instead marched on Rome. Holy fuck. That is insane. So basically nobody was expecting this. And remember earlier when I talked about how the onus had been put on the general for providing the money for the army, and how the people who now made up the army were becoming more loyal to their general than to the state. This is some of the problems that came from that. Had this been a pre-Marian army, these troops would probably have refused to march on the Eternal City, but that was just not a thing anymore. This was an army who did not have any more loyalty to Rome than they had to Sulla, and so, when Sulla arrived in Rome, he was pelted by rocks from the houses. It was then he ordered that his troops were to find every house that they were having stones thrown at them from and burn it to the fucking ground. The city is taken, and Sulla declares himself to be consul again as he was rightfully elected, and he then begins a purge of his political enemies. Gaius Marius flees the city and starts up his own army elsewhere in the provinces. It's at this point also that a man named Sertorius starts up his own army in Iberia to resist Sulla if he goes there, and this insurgency would last for years. But with all of his problems at home apparently sorted, Sulla returns to the war. By the time that he arrives back in Anatolia, Marius has got his army and again marches on Rome. And so, Rome's first civil war begins between the pro-Marians and the pro-Sullans. When Marius arrives in Rome, he carries out an even bigger purge than Sulla. In fact, this is where the dreaded lists come out. Lists of Romans who are to be executed, mostly political enemies of Marius. And on these dreaded lists appears two names that we're going to run into later: Marcus Licinius Crassus and Gnaeus Pompey Magnus. These are two people who we're going to get into more in the next video, but just keep those names in mind. So, Sulla hears about what's going on, but he ignores it, and he continues to fight Mythridates. The reason that he does this is because Gaius Marius fucking dies. Now, this is not some kind of assassination or anything. Dude's just old. He's in his 70s by this point, so this is to be expected. However, although Marius dies, his faction are still there, and they send out another army to go and, well, one, to destroy Mythridates, but also to capture Sulla and return him to Rome. This new army arrives in Anatolia and joins the war. However, something very strange happens. Mithridates enters into negotiations with Sulla to surrender, but he does not surrender to Rome. He surrenders exclusively to Sulla. In his surrender, he dictates that he gives up all claim to Cappadocia and to Bithynia, but in exchange, Sulla, and by extension Rome, recognizes him as the rightful king of all of his current territory, which is this. And then it happens. Sulla joins up with Mithridates to destroy this new army under the Marian faction. The Marian army does not fare well. After this army is destroyed, Sulla again marches on Rome. And again, he carries out some truly massive purges. And once again, out comes the dreaded lists. And in this one, Sulla puts on his lists another name which we're going to be talking about a lot in the next episode. Gaius Julius Caesar. By the end of all of this, in 81 BC, Sulla was dictator of Rome. However, due to his conservative viewpoint on how things had been going, he chose this point to step down from his dictatorship and then run for consul, as before, which he then won. In 79 BC, he resigned from the Senate and retired from political life entirely, withdrawing to his country villa near Puertoli. For the next year, he wrote his memoirs before dying of liver failure. Upon his tombstone was carved the epitaph, "No friend ever served me, and no enemy ever wronged me, whom I have not repaid in full." Alongside this was carved Sulla's personal motto: "No better friend, no worse enemy." And with that, I think I'm going to end it for this episode. At the end of this episode, we see Rome having been racked with horrible civil war for the first time in its existence, with both sides eventually dissolving, and the Republic being restored. In the next episode, we're going to talk about one of the most infamous chapters in Roman history. This has been Graf. I will see you next time. Thank you very much.